The evening had started off in a perfectly ordinary way in Chicago. Dr. Richard Harris, who had spent over 20 years working as a physician in the community, was just finishing up his paperwork as the last few rays of daylight slipped through the cracks of the blinds in his clinic. The waiting room was almost empty now, with only a few soft murmurs echoing from the corridor. He was ready to close for the day, already thinking of the dinner he would have at home, when he glanced down his schedule and noticed that Frederick Miller and his teenage daughter, Emily, were coming in as the final appointment. He knew the Millers. They were regular patients. Frederick had the kind of presence that filled a room, always sharply dressed and on top of every detail. When Dr. Harris opened the exam room door, though, his eyes immediately caught the stiff, uncomfortable way Emily sat on the edge of her chair. She kept her head down, her long hair falling like a curtain to hide her face, and her eyes rarely left her sneakers. Richard tried to reassure himself that plenty of teenagers hated doctor visits. Still, the tension in the room felt different this time, thicker, almost tangible. Frederick's voice was as steady as always, answering questions before Emily could speak, steering the conversation back to small talk about grades and school events. But every time his daughter tried to answer, her words trailed off, and she seemed to shrink into herself even more. It was impossible not to notice how she flinched with every sharp glance her father sent her way. Dr. Harris was used to nervous patients, but the air in the small clinic office seemed heavy with something greater than nerves. He found himself glancing at Emily a little more closely with every question. While Frederick talked, Richard noticed the way Emily's arms stayed close to her body, the way her shoulders hunched, her gaze locked on the floor. It struck him that her silence spoke volumes, and that the faint hope he might have misread the situation was quickly vanishing. As the minutes ticked by, an invisible current of anxiety seemed to wrap around them all, turning even the ticking of the wall clock into a reminder that something important was hiding just beneath the surface, waiting to be revealed. Behind the scenes, as the evening was winding down, Dr. Harris found himself pausing for a moment in the hallway, silently gathering his thoughts before tackling the last of his paperwork. It was then that Rachel Bryant, the nurse who had worked by his side for nearly 6 years, caught him by the arm. Rachel was never one to gossip or dramatize things, but her tone was unusually low and serious as she shared her concerns. Rachel described what she had seen earlier during Emily's intake. When Rachel had asked simple questions, like if Emily had any allergies or was taking any medication, Frederick had always interrupted, answering for his daughter. Even when the questions were clearly about things only Emily should know, like when her last period was, or if she was having any trouble sleeping, Frederick was quick with a firm response, barely letting Emily get a word in. "It was strange, Richard," Rachel said, her arms folded across her chest. "He would not let that girl speak for herself, and every time I tried to ask her directly, he just took over. The whole thing felt wrong." She also mentioned how Emily seemed to grow smaller and more anxious with each passing minute. Her hands would twist together in her lap, and she only met Rachel's eyes for a second or two before looking away. "I know shy kids," Rachel whispered, glancing around to make sure nobody overheard. This wasn't shyness. It was like she wasn't allowed to answer, or like she was scared to. Her words carried a heaviness that settled right between them. Dr. Harris found himself reviewing everything he'd already observed, and he knew Rachel's instincts were rarely wrong. If she felt uneasy, there was more to it than just a moody teenager or an overprotective parent. Rachel's quiet insistence that something more serious was unfolding behind the surface made Richard feel an increasing urgency to look deeper. He couldn't ignore the possibility that what seemed on the outside to be an ordinary family visit was, in truth, hiding something painful. The hallway suddenly seemed colder, and he realized there simply was no comfortable way to shrug off the unease that was quickly spreading between him and his trusted co-worker. In that moment, any trace of the routine, safe clinic evening gave way to a sense that real trouble might be lurking just around the corner. Back in the exam room, Dr. Harris did his best to set a welcoming tone. He asked casual questions about school, favorite books, even Chicago sports, hoping something might help Emily relax. However, every time he tried to direct a question to her, Frederick immediately responded for her. His words precise, and leaving no room for Emily to share her own thoughts. It was clear to Richard that Frederick was guarding every detail and holding his daughter beneath a constant, watchful gaze. Emily's posture didn't change. Her arms still hugged her sides tightly. But when Dr. Harris suggested an ultrasound, saying it was routine and could help check for any underlying health issues, Emily looked up for just a heartbeat. Their eyes met. She did not say much, just nodded, a tiny movement, but enough. In that brief moment, Richard noticed something flicker in her expression, a sort of quiet hope mixed with fear. She glanced at her father as if seeking approval, but then, trusting the space Dr. Harris offered, agreed softly. Frederick tried to interject, insisting the test was unnecessary and that Emily was perfectly healthy. "She's never had a problem, doctor," he said with a firm edge in his voice. "It's just stress. Kids these days get overwhelmed by nothing." But Dr. Harris calmly explained that the scan was simple and non-invasive and really just a part of her routine care. Finally, and perhaps only because Dr. Harris seemed insistent, Frederick relented. Still, he hovered close by, as if making sure nothing would be said or done out of his sight. As Dr. Harris prepared the machine, Rachel came in to help set up, deliberately making a point of speaking gently to Emily, giving her little reminders about how everything worked. There was a tension in the room, but under it, something had shifted. When Emily lifted her shirt, hands shaking just a bit, it was as if she accepted the moment for what it was, an act of trust, even if she could not put it into words. Richard's attention was sharply tuned into the quiet. The unspoken story told by Emily's cooperation struck him more deeply than any tearful confession might have. That fragile nod stood out as a call for help, one small break in the wall of silence built so carefully around her. Even under the control of Frederick's presence, Emily's simple gesture shined through, hinting at a deeper truth just waiting to be seen. As the ultrasound began, the energy in the room shifted from quiet wariness to something far more urgent. The gentle whirring of the machine filled the silence, and Dr. Harris focused intently on the screen. His seasoned eyes quickly picked up on things that were just not right. The dates Emily had given, really the ones Frederick had given, did not add up with what the images were showing. The pregnancy was much further along than anyone had stated. It was not just that. There were deeper, more serious signs. The baby's growth was behind, not matching up with what he expected. When Dr. Harris checked the heartbeat, his concern doubled. It was not as regular as it should have been, another red flag he could not ignore. Dr. Harris kept his voice steady as he asked Rachel to note a few observations and quietly handed her a slip of paper behind Frederick's back. Emily stared at the ceiling, her hands trembling, while Frederick started to shift impatiently, perhaps sensing that something was going on that was out of his control. The mood became more strained with each passing minute. Dr. Harris, used to tough situations, felt the pressure mounting as Frederick questioned everything. "Is this really necessary? She's just tired. Can't we go home?" he demanded, his fingers drumming irritably against the chair arm. But Richard, seeing the outline of the baby on the monitor and the serious irregularities, knew he could not back down. He turned to Frederick with calm but unmistakable urgency in his eyes. "Mr. Miller, I am very concerned about your daughter and her baby. The signs here are worrying, and she needs to be admitted to Northwestern Memorial Hospital right away." They have all the specialists and equipment she needs for care. He spoke directly, but avoided alarming Emily too much, glancing at Rachel for support. Frederick bristled, ready to argue, but Dr. Harris cut in firmly. We cannot wait. This is important, for both of them. I will take care of transferring her, and Rachel will help arrange transportation, he added, signaling to his nurse that this was not up for discussion. It was a dramatic moment, everyone in the room feeling the gravity of the news. Emily looked at Dr. Harris, her eyes wide, uncertain whether to feel relief or more fear. But as Rachel reassured her gently, she squeezed Emily's hand, hinting without words that she was not alone in this. Dr. Harris's worried face told the story. This was now much more than a routine checkup. The pushback from Frederick was immediate and stronger than Dr. Harris expected. More than just stubbornness, it felt like he was resisting with every ounce of willpower. As if admitting Emily to the hospital might break open a secret he was desperate to keep hidden. Frederick's face tightened, his eyes cold as steel. He squared his shoulders and insisted there was no need for further action. She's fine, he repeated again, voice sharp. It's an overreaction. That place will just stress her out. The firm set of his jaw, the way he spoke over Emily, announced he was not ready to yield. Richard could sense the tension radiating from both father and daughter now. Emily looked at her knees, silent and motionless, while Frederick's grip on her arm was nearly possessive. Rachel stood off to the side, trying to appear busy with paperwork, but glancing up, ready to step in if needed. Dr. Harris felt troubled by how his usual authority as a physician seemed to hold no weight with Frederick, which was unusual for him in his career at the busy Chicago clinic. He realized this moment was teetering on a sharp edge. If he pressed too hard, he might risk losing any influence he had left. But if he did nothing, he would fail Emily and her unborn child. There was something about Frederick's agitation and defensive posture that said there was much more here than a simple medical misunderstanding. Making a careful choice, Dr. Harris turned to Frederick and said he would finish printing out the ultrasound images and gather the referral paperwork himself. You can pick up Emily's prescription from the pharmacy next door while I get everything together, he said in his calmest voice. Frederick scowled but relented, clearly not wanting to appear uncooperative in front of Rachel or other staff who were now starting to close up for the night. As Frederick tightened his coat and stalked out of the office, leading Emily by the elbow, Dr. Harris caught Emily's eye for a brief second. He gave her a look that said, "You're not alone," hoping she would find the courage to stay behind when her father left. Rachel quickly offered to help Emily with her coat and mumbled that Dr. Harris just needed a minute more. Time seemed to slow, everyone in the room waiting to see whether the fragile thread of trust would hold, if only for this critical moment. As soon as Frederick stepped out, the change in the room was obvious. It felt like a thin layer of pressure had lifted, even if just a little. Rachel gently asked Emily if she needed some water and helped her sit down again. Dr. Harris took the ultrasound images from the printer and moved to sit nearby, careful not to overwhelm her. For a moment it was quiet, except for the distant muffled sounds of the closing clinic. Emily's hands trembled as she smoothed her shirt over her belly. She glanced at Dr. Harris, her eyes searching, then quickly darted back to the floor as though she might get in trouble just for making eye contact. Hesitantly, in a whisper so soft that even Rachel had to lean closer to catch it, Emily said, "She always moves when he talks. The baby. Every time she hears his voice, she moves a lot. I hate that." The way she said it sent a chill through Dr. Harris. There was more to Emily's words than the typical worries of a nervous mom-to-be. The mix of dread, resentment, and fear spoke volumes from that single, careful sentence. Her statement hung in the air, a small, sad confession that was more than it seemed, and a window into a situation that went far beyond medical problems. Dr. Harris exchanged a glance with Rachel, both realizing the weight of what had just been revealed. In that quiet, there was no mistaking the message woven into Emily's words. Something in her home or in her relationship with her father was terribly wrong. Still, before Dr. Harris could gently ask her to talk more, Emily's shoulders hunched in again and the wall of silence snapped back up. She only shook her head, eyes squeezed tightly shut, signaling she had already said too much. Rachel knelt beside her, offering a reassuring touch on her hand. "We're here for you," she said softly, not wanting to pressure Emily but hoping to give her a sense of safety. The two adults exchanged another silent look. This was not a typical case for a community clinic. They both understood there was little time and that getting Emily help would require more than medicine. The reality before them was no longer about checkups or prescriptions. It was now about doing the right thing, no matter how hard that might turn out to be. Even after the clinic had closed and the staff had trickled out, Dr. Harris could not shake the feeling that Emily's words were wedged somewhere in his mind, repeating themselves every time he tried to let go. He tried to convince himself that what he saw was just a family under pressure, that maybe it was just the stress of an unexpected pregnancy and all the complicated emotions that came with it. Still, the knot in his stomach would not go away. The image of Emily, withdrawn and frightened, combined with Frederick's hostile resistance, kept replaying in flashes as he drove home through the quiet Chicago streets. Richard's plan was to go straight home and get some rest, hopeful that Emily and her father would do the right thing and take her to the hospital. But as he made his way down West Belmont Avenue, something caught his eye. Frederick's white sedan was parked in front of their house, not far from the neighborhood's big corner store where everyone bought their groceries on weekends. Richard slowed and stared for a moment. It was hours past the time he had strongly suggested that Emily go to Northwestern Memorial, and yet here was their car. Definitely not at the hospital like he had urged. He pulled into a parking space across the street, heart still pounding with worry. Richard's mind raced with questions. Maybe they had just stopped at home to grab something, he thought, but that did not fit with the urgency of the situation he had explained. The most troubling idea was the one he could not shake. Perhaps Emily had never even been meant to leave the house that night, that Frederick's resistance was a deliberate effort to keep her isolated, regardless of medical risk. The responsibility felt heavier than ever. Richard knew the codes of his job, the boundaries between clinic and family life, but he kept thinking of Emily's voice quivering as she spoke about the baby's reaction to Frederick and the way she shrank back into silence. He glanced down, the block at their porch light glowing through the dusk, and felt he could not just drive home and pretend all this was not his problem anymore. After a moment of hesitation, Richard tucked his stethoscope into his pocket and walked up the path. To the miller's front door, he knocked, not loudly but firm enough, hoping someone inside would answer. Standing there, he felt the weight of all his worry settle onto his shoulders as he waited for a sign that someone would let him in and finally explain what was really going on behind those walls. The door opened just a crack, catching on the chain. Frederick's face appeared in the gap, his expression guarded and a little irritated, as if he had expected that someone might come knocking, but wished otherwise. The glow from the hallway behind him cut a sharp line across his face. He didn't invite Richard in, but let the door swing a bit wider while he remained in the way. "What is it, Dr. Harris?" "It's late," Frederick said, keeping his voice low and even. There was no sign of Emily, no sound at all except a television in another room. Richard took a steadying breath, suddenly aware of how odd the whole situation felt, standing on a neighbor's stoop at nearly 10 at night, having to explain his concern as if he did not have every reason to be there. "I just wanted to check on Emily. I noticed your car in the driveway, and I wanted to make sure she'd gotten to the hospital okay. You remember how urgent I said this was. I just want to be sure she's getting the care she needs." Richard watched Frederick's eyes carefully, looking for any sign of truth or evasion. Frederick hesitated, then replied, "Oh, she already left." He folded his arms, deflecting any further attempt at conversation. "Her mother took her. They're on their way to Northwestern Memorial now." That did not add up. In all the years Richard had worked at the clinic and lived a few blocks away from the Millers, he could not recall more than 1 or 2 times when he had actually met or even seen Emily's mother. She was almost an invisible presence, never at appointments, never on the porch when neighborhood events were going on, never in the background of daily family comings and goings. Even thinking back to parent-teacher conferences his wife had mentioned from the school down the street, Richard only ever heard about Frederick showing up alone, tightly in charge. Frederick's explanation sounded rehearsed, almost too neat, and it rang hollow against the memory of Emily's words back. At the clinic, everything about this new story felt like a smokescreen, another effort to block off anyone asking questions about what was going on in their home. Richard felt the weight of suspicion grow, the missing pieces stacking up in his mind. He realized that behind Frederick's careful answers, a bigger truth was being hidden, and the urgency of finding out what it was only deepened. Once Richard left the Miller's porch, something inside him would not let the matter rest. The implausible story Frederick offered, paired with the mother's near invisibility in both neighborhood life and Emily's medical history, nagged at him well past midnight. Sitting at his kitchen table, the lamplight bright but the house otherwise quiet, Richard decided he had to take a next step, even if it meant crossing usual lines. He opened his laptop and pulled up Facebook, typing in the name Molly Miller, hoping he could find any connection to Emily's mother. Social media had its frustrations, but sometimes it was the only way to reach people who were deliberately kept out of their own child's life. After a few tries and a scroll through mutual Chicago connections, Richard found a profile that matched the bits he remembered. A wedding photo from over a decade ago, some likes on old posts from neighborhood groups, but not much else. He hesitated for just a second, then typed a short, polite message explaining who he was and that he was concerned about Emily. He mentioned the urgent medical issue and tactfully asked if Molly knew where her daughter was. Less than 15 minutes later, a reply came in, full of obvious worry and confusion. Molly responded in rapid-fire messages, each one more anxious than the last. She explained she had not seen Emily in months and had received no information about a doctor's appointment or any emergency. Most painfully, she told Richard that some time back, after a bitter court dispute, she had been forced to stay away by legal orders. All decisions about Emily's daily life and healthcare had stayed with Frederick, and Molly confessed, "I only hear from her through messages every few weeks, and even then it's only when Frederick allows. I have no clue what's happening with her now, and I fear for her all the time." With that truth, Richard's worry turned to a sinking certainty. A pattern was emerging, one marked by isolation and control. Frederick had kept everyone at arm's length, not just friends and neighbors, but even his own wife, using the law as a shield. This was not a simple family disagreement. Emily was potentially being held away from all support. Richard started to see the outline of something much darker underneath it all. It was clear that urgent action was needed. He could no longer put faith in family cooperation or parental reassurances. It was time to call in those who could truly help. Richard knew he could not avoid telling Molly everything he had seen at the clinic, yet he still tried to choose his words carefully. He shared details about Emily's appearance, the fear in her eyes, her reluctance to speak, and how Frederick reacted each time someone suggested they visit the hospital. He explained about Emily's strange comment regarding the babies, reaction to Frederick's voice, and how anxious she became as soon as her father re-entered the room. Richard emphasized his concern that Emily's health and safety might be in real danger. On the other end of the messages, Molly's responses came quickly, full of raw emotion. She told Richard about the court battles that had played out years before in downtown Chicago, about the day she had been forced to leave their family home. Molly described how Frederick had consistently positioned himself as the stable parent to the judge, painting her as unreliable and winning exclusive custody of Emily. The legal system, overwhelmed and cold, had not given her much chance to explain her side. The court order barred her from contacting Emily directly, beyond rare and supervised calls. Since then, she had watched from afar on social media, always hoping to somehow stay in touch, never able to drop by the house or school. Receiving news now of Emily's pregnancy shook Molly. She wrote that she just kept thinking she should have tried harder, fought longer, or refused to leave. Reading her messages, Richard could feel her heartbreak and guilt spilling through the screen. She told him, "I feel helpless, Richard. I have not talked to her for months, and now I hear about this from a neighbor and doctor, not her own family. Please, please do what you can to keep her safe." Her anxiety became Richard's as well. Every new detail deepened their shared concern and convinced him that isolation was not just a side effect. It was a deliberate tactic. Richard reassured her, promising to keep her updated and to let her know if he saw or heard anything out of the ordinary. He explained he would check on Emily himself and also planned to inform the right authorities if things got worse. Before ending their exchange, Richard made sure Molly had his cell number and agreed that they would both pay close attention to any sign of activity at the Miller's house. Closing his laptop, Richard took a deep breath, steeling himself for one more visit to the family's home that night, determined not to let Emily slip through the cracks. Richard found himself standing once more in front of the Miller home. The sky now fully dark, and the neighborhood even quieter than before. His nerves buzzed with a mix of frustration and worry. He knocked firmly this time, determined not to walk away without answers. After a longer pause than before, Frederick opened the door, squinting with annoyance and barely masking his irritation. He did not bother with small talk, instead motioning silently for Richard to enter. Inside, the house was mostly dark, only a dim lamp in the living room casting enough light to make out the furniture. The air felt stale, heavy with the sense that any wrong move would bring everything crashing down. Frederick stood by the wall, arms folded tight across his chest, glaring at Richard with a cold, almost mocking expression. Emily was there too, sitting on the far edge of the couch, curled up small and silent. Her knees were pulled to her chest, eyes fixed on a spot on the carpet, anywhere but on the two men in the room. Richard walked in, trying his best to keep his voice calm and measured. "I came because I am truly worried about Emily," he began, glancing toward her but directing his words at Frederick. "She needs medical care immediately, and I need to know if you're willing to do what's best for her, for both her sake and the baby's." Frederick scoffed, his answer sharp and lined with sarcasm. "It's awfully late now for house calls, isn't it, Doc? You sure you're not overstepping here?" Every time Richard tried to bring up the pregnancy or Emily's symptoms, Frederick responded with dismissive jokes or with thinly veiled comments about meddling neighbors. The whole conversation felt like stumbling through a minefield. Richard could feel his patience thinning as each evasion piled up. He watched Emily out of the corner of his eye, hoping for a sign, something to confirm what Molly had told him, something solid he could use to justify calling outside help. He knew if she showed even the faintest plea for help, anything, even a shake of the head, a whispered word, or the briefest moment of eye contact, he would be justified in escalating things, no matter how much Frederick tried to keep control. The pressure in the room almost felt physical, as though everyone was waiting for a single moment to break the tension and finally show the truth. The standoff in the living room stretched on until the sharp ring of the doorbell broke the tension. Frederick grumbled under his breath, shooting Richard an icy glare as he marched off to answer the door. The moment the front door shut behind Frederick, the mood in the room changed. Emily's hands shook as she looked up at Richard, her face pale but set with newfound resolve. She moved quickly, almost like she had practiced or waited for just such an opportunity. With a trembling hand, she slipped out a small bundle of photos from the inside pocket of her hoodie and pressed them into Richard's hand. "There are more in my room," she whispered, so soft it barely rose above the hum of the refrigerator down the hall. Richard glanced down at the pictures, instantly realizing they showed bruises, some old, some fresh, on her arms and shoulders. With each image, the situation grew clearer and more urgent. Though he was no stranger to tough cases, Richard felt his own heart drop, seeing concrete evidence of what he had feared all along. He looked up at Emily, her eyes pleading, her body tense with fear but also hope, and all doubt vanished. She was not just needing medical care. She needed to be rescued, and she was asking for his help in the only way she dared. Richard squeezed Emily's hand gently, promising in the same whisper, "I'll make sure you're safe. I'm going to help you, Emily. I promise." It was a moment of quiet courage, and for the first time all night, Richard saw a faint flicker of relief pass across her face. Frederick's footsteps soon echoed back from the foyer, louder and harsher now. The careful, silent exchange was over, but nothing would ever be the same. Emily was no longer just a patient passed between adults at odds. She had taken a risk and handed over her trust. As Frederick returned, carrying a bag from the stoop and checking the living room for any change, Richard tucked the photos into his pocket alongside his stethoscope. The scene returned to its tense, normal, but within that pressured hush, a new urgency pulsed. Emily was now a survivor trying to reach out, and Richard knew there was no way he could walk away or wait any longer. He was committed, and tonight he would make sure the right people were called so that Emily would not have to face another night alone in that house. Richard left the Miller house, feeling as though the night air pressed down on his chest. He did not let himself look back, not even once, afraid Frederick might see his face and notice something was off. Instead, he hurried down the quiet sidewalk, and only when he was safely 2 blocks away did he dare to pull out the bundle of photos. Emily had slipped him. Under a street lamp, Richard sorted through the images, his hands trembling as the full truth unfolded. What he saw went far beyond scrapes and bruises from rough discipline. Some of the photos showed clear and undeniable signs of sexual abuse, details he could never have misinterpreted. Each image brought a new wave of horror, not just at what Emily had suffered, but at the realization that Frederick, her father, was the one responsible. Richard's stomach turned, his thoughts running from shock to anger to a bone-deep sense of responsibility. There was no way he could second-guess or rationalize what he held in his hands. No way to think of this as just a family matter or a misunderstanding that would blow over. All his years practicing medicine in Chicago, Richard had run into all types of complicated family dramas. But those memories wilted in comparison to this. He knew plainly the difference now between his job as a doctor and the simple duty to protect a child from a monster. There was no going back, no room left for protocol or politeness, and certainly no choice but to pick up the phone and get help immediately. Taking a deep breath, Richard dialed 911 and explained everything he knew to the dispatcher. His position as Emily's physician, the timeline of events from the clinic visit to the late-night confrontation, and now the evidence in his hands. He told her he had proof that Emily was in immediate danger and that she needed protection and rescue without any delay. He waited for clear instructions, repeating that he would remain in the area until police and child protective services arrived. In that moment, Richard was no longer just Emily's neighbor and doctor. He was a lifeline. It was a terrible kind of burden, but he was ready to do whatever it would take to finally help Emily find a way into safety, whatever the risk to himself or the backlash in the neighborhood. Still standing under the cold glow of the street lamp, Richard did his best to keep his voice steady as he spoke with the operator. He relayed every detail he could remember: Emily's age, her medical condition, the specifics of their earlier encounter at the clinic, and most importantly, the evidence he now possessed. He described the photos one by one, his heart pounding with each word, making sure the authorities understood that the threat was real and immediate, not some misunderstanding that could wait until morning. He pleaded for urgency, insisting that Emily's life and that of her unborn child could depend on how fast help arrived. The dispatcher assured him that units were already en route, that child protective services would be called in, and that his actions were absolutely the right thing to do. Once the call ended, Richard knew there was something else he had to do. He took out his phone again, this time pulling up Molly's number, and sent her copies of the photos, along with a message that said, "I have called the police. They are on the way. Emily needs you." Even though he knew how painful it would be, he felt she deserved to be part of what came next. For so long, she had been left in the dark. Now she could finally be involved, hopefully on her daughter's side as things moved forward. Minutes stretched on as Richard paced back and forth on the sidewalk, staying within sight of the Miller house, but keeping himself hidden from view. The usual hum of downtown Chicago was replaced by a strange, oppressive quiet, only broken when he caught himself replaying the images in his mind. The ache of helplessness grew as he thought about what Emily must have endured alone in that house. Night after night, never knowing if anyone would ever step in or believe her. Now, with the authorities on their way, he worried about what might happen inside before the squad cars arrived. Would Frederick become suspicious? Would he take things out on Emily for what he might sense had been done? Standing there, Richard willed every passing minute to go faster. He kept his phone gripped tightly, ready to dial again if anything went wrong. Each second that ticked by fueled his resolve to make sure that, no matter what, things would not go back to the way they had been before, not for Emily, not on his watch. Eventually, the stillness of the night broke as the distant whir of sirens grew louder and flashes of red and blue bounced off the brick homes that lined the block. Within minutes, 3 patrol cars slid to a stop in front of the Miller house, the sudden arrival turning the quiet residential street into a scene that felt almost unreal. Richard saw Officer Jessica Bennett step out first, clipboard in hand, her eyes scanning the crowd for someone who could explain what was happening. Richard moved quickly to meet her at the curb, taking a steadying breath before launching into the story. He spoke clearly, giving Officer Bennett and the other officers the entire chronology, from Emily's visit to his clinic, to his suspicions, to his conversations with Molly and the confrontation inside the house that night. Richard handed over the stack of photos, pointing out the most damning evidence and sharing the details of Emily's whispered plea. "There should be more proof in Emily's room," he explained, lifting a shaking finger to indicate the front window. "She took a huge risk to get these to me." Officer Bennett nodded with quiet seriousness, handing off the evidence to a detective and calling for backup before turning her focus to the assignment at hand. Officers spread out, some making their way toward the entrance, while another pair circled the back of the house. The rest of the neighbors had started trickling onto their porches, wordlessly gathering in loose clusters beneath the swirling lights, drawn by the noise and curiosity, but quickly sobered by the tone of what they heard Richard sharing. One neighbor in particular, an older man named Mr. Carter, the person who had witnessed some odd behavior a few days before, stepped forward and quietly spoke with the officers, confirming that he too had concerns, but had never believed things could be this bad. The search and rescue inside the house was conducted methodically, but with a real sense of speed. Officers insisted that Frederick wait in the living room while two detectives searched for the additional evidence in Emily's room, just as Richard had described. Every voice in the crowd remained hushed, each person feeling differently, some uncertain, some in shock, others overcome by guilt at having lived so close for so long and never guessing the truth. When Detective Ramirez came out, holding a second envelope of photos and other documents, the mood shifted further. There would be no more doubt about what had happened here. For the first time since the whole ordeal began, Richard felt something close to relief. As officers methodically moved through the Miller house, the situation suddenly spiraled into chaos. By the time Detective Ramirez exited with the new evidence, another officer gave a sharp call for backup. Frederick, realizing his world was crumbling, had managed to grab Emily and with a burst of desperation dragged her upstairs. Ignoring frantic commands to stop, he forced open a dusty attic window and led her out onto the garage roof. Neighbors stared in disbelief as flashlights and police spotlights trained on the two figures trembling on the edge of the roofline. Frederick's voice sliced through the night, raw and erratic, threatening harm if anyone came closer. He clung to Emily's arm, holding her just out of reach, a look of fear and madness in his eyes. A tense standoff took hold, officers freezing in place, exchanging quick hand signals and murmuring low into their radios. Detective Ramirez steadied, his voice trying to talk Frederick down. "Let her go, Frederick. No one needs to get hurt. We're here to help." The crowd that had gathered below stood silent and motionless. Every second felt stretched, with everyone afraid to even breathe wrong. Emily's face was streaked with tears, her body rigid, but for the first time, something else glittered in her eyes, a stubborn hope, sparked by the chaos but not yet gone. It was in this boiling moment that Molly's car screeched to a halt just yards away. She ran through the police tape, dodging the outstretched arms of officers trying to hold her back. Her voice rose up, raw with terror and love, echoing off every brick and porch on the street. "Emily! Baby, hold on! I'm here, honey! I'm not leaving you again." Her plea cut through the tension. Emily's head turned, searching through the darkness. That one moment of recognition seemed to give Emily something to hold on to, a reason to resist, to keep fighting. The police, noticing the shift, acted quickly but carefully. While Molly kept talking, drawing Frederick's scattered focus, two officers looped quietly onto the roof from another angle. In a flash of coordinated movement, they grabbed Frederick, pulling him away and freeing Emily, wrapping her instantly in the safety of their arms. The crowd finally let out the breath they had held, and Richard stepped forward, ready to be there for Emily as the world finally began to make sense again. As the chaos on the Miller roof reached its peak, Frederick's grip on reality seemed to shatter entirely. With a wild, desperate glare, he suddenly shoved Emily toward the edge. Time felt distorted for everyone watching. People gasped and shouted, several neighbors covering their eyes, convinced they were about to witness something unbearable. But the police had seen the danger coming. In the seconds beforehand, two firefighters had set up a large inflatable mattress just beneath the edge of the garage roof, their movements practiced and urgent. As Emily fell, she landed heavily but safely onto the bright orange cushion, a loud thump echoing in the otherwise silent night. Frederick tried to bolt across the roof in the distraction, but the officers were faster. They tackled him before. He got 3 steps, wrestled him down and snapped cuffs around his wrists. He screamed and fought like a trapped animal, swearing and lashing out at anyone within reach. Every head on the street watched as he was marched away, every ounce of fight draining from his body as the humiliation and rage replaced the power he once held over his daughter. Emily, shaken but alive, was quickly surrounded by paramedics, who had been waiting just off to the side. They eased her onto a stretcher, checking for injuries and asking gentle questions to keep her calm. Richard was already at her side, quietly explaining that she was safe now and urging her to take slow breaths. He checked her pulse and listened for the baby's heartbeat, a wave of relief washing over him as the steady thump of the fetal monitor rang out, loud and clear. Emily's eyes were wide with shock, but when she heard that sound and saw the concerned but relieved faces around her, she finally allowed herself to cry. Molly arrived at the ambulance a few moments later, tears streaming down her face, her hands shaking as she reached for her daughter. She wrapped Emily in a fierce hug, whispering apologies and promises to stay with her from now on. The moment felt raw, fragile, and almost too painful to watch. But as the two clung to each other, Emily's sobs mingling with her mother's, desperate reassurances, a kind of peace settled over those watching. For the first time in years, the cycle of fear and silence was broken, and it was clear to everyone that a different future was possible. When Emily finally arrived at Northwestern Hospital in downtown Chicago, the night was far from over for her and those who cared for her. Dr. Teresa Clark, the head of pediatric trauma, wasted no time gathering her team. Emily was quickly transferred onto a hospital bed and wheeled into a private exam room. Her mother, Molly, never more than a few steps away. The fluorescent lights and the constant beep of medical machines set a cold tone, but the warmth from Dr. Clark and the steady presence of Richard helped cut through the overwhelming sense of uncertainty. Emily's condition worried the staff. She was underweight, her cheeks sunken from weeks of poor nutrition, and her nerves showed in every glance and twitch. Dr. Clark ordered an immediate series of tests to check Emily's vitals, monitor her pregnancy closely, and address physical injuries, both old and new. Nurses explained everything softly, asking for consent before every procedure, which helped settle her nerves a bit. Richard stood at the doorway, watching with a doctor's eye, but also a friend's concern, making sure Emily and Molly felt supported and not alone. Molly stayed at her daughter's side, refusing even a glass of water until she was sure Emily was stable. She stroked her daughter's hair and murmured quiet encouragements as the doctors did their work. Every time the ultrasound picked up the baby's heartbeat, a flicker of hope washed over them, a sweet reminder that life persisted even after so much pain. Dr. Clark updated them with every bit of progress, promising to look after Emily as if she were her own family. Later, officers from the Chicago Police Department and a team of social workers arrived. They asked if Emily felt up to telling her story, reminding her that she was in control. Sitting in the hospital room with her mom holding her hand, Emily began to describe everything. She spoke about the years of abuse, the loneliness and confusion, and the decisions she made to protect herself and gather evidence. It was hard, and at times her voice faltered, but her determination saw her through to the end. When she finally finished, exhaustion etched her face, but a strange sense of relief settled in. For once, she had been heard. Surrounded by both old and new sources of support, Emily faced the first morning after her nightmare ended with more hope than she'd had in a long time. As Emily's statement made its way through the halls of the hospital and over to the Chicago Police Department, it triggered a much wider investigation than anyone first expected. Detectives went back to the Miller house with a search warrant in hand, taking their time combing through every room and closet. In the process, they stumbled across a small, almost hidden door behind a stack of boxes in the basement laundry. The room beyond was dark and felt secretive, with old filing cabinets, a locked safe, and boxes of tapes and photos neatly stacked on wooden shelves. The air felt heavy, every surface carrying the weight of what had gone on for so long in silence. The detectives quietly documented everything. They catalogued evidence of years' worth of surveillance and manipulation. Locks kept on Emily's door, Journals filled with Frederick's handwriting detailing rules for her behavior, and videos that left even the experienced officers shaken. The pattern was clear. It was not just moments of anger, but a long and systematic process of control and abuse. The case suddenly became larger than a single incident, revealing the depth of what Emily had endured and survived. This realization had a powerful effect on everyone involved. Members of the social services team from the Illinois Department of Children and Family Services attended briefings alongside the police and hospital staff. They spoke quietly in the hallways, voices tinged with disbelief and determination. Much of their work now focused on helping Emily and her unborn child rebuild their lives, from securing safe housing and counseling to developing plans for a long road of healing ahead. At the same time, the legal team acted quickly to protect Emily's future. Using the evidence found in the hidden room, they began petitioning for full custody to be granted to Molly, whose past battles with substance use and the courts had always been a dark cloud overhead. Suddenly, those struggles became a mark of strength. Molly's journey from despair to recovery was recognized as an act of persistence and love, not shame, and she became a voice of hope for other parents in similar fights. The Miller family's future was not suddenly perfect, and everyone understood there would be setbacks and tough days. But little by little, bits of hope broke through. The pieces of their broken story began shifting from memories of harm to moments of new beginning, a slow, steady path toward a safer home, lasting trust, and, for the first time in years, the real possibility of healing. With the evidence uncovered and the slow wheels of justice beginning to move, the atmosphere in Emily's hospital room started to shift from tension to something softer and more hopeful. The room itself became a small sanctuary in the middle of all the change. Molly was there day and night, pulling her chair close to the bed, making sure Emily never felt alone, not even for a moment. There were long stretches where the two said little at all, just soaking in the simple comfort of being together with no secrets and no threats pressing down on them. As dawn crept in through the small window, painting the room with a gentle gold light, Emily finally found the words to express what she truly wanted. She reached for her mother's hand, her voice steady, in a way it had not been for years. "I want to keep the baby, Mom. It is not the baby's fault how any of this happened. I want to give them a chance to have what we never got. Honesty, safety, maybe even happiness." Molly, surprised at first, squeezed her daughter's hand tight, promising she would be there every step of the way. For the first time, their connection grew without fear shadowing it, built on choices freely made and trust restored piece by piece. In those moments, the hospital room was filled more with hope than with the anxiety or pain that had defined the past. Emily's decision seemed to settle something deep inside both women, a fresh start, even as they faced the daunting challenges that lay ahead. The fear was still there, winding quietly around worries of money, health, and the future, but it no longer ruled their every thought. Instead, there was a new determination and most of all a belief that neither of them would have to face the next day's hardships alone. Just as the sun fully broke over the city skyline, Richard stepped into the room one last time. He looked tired, his shirt rumpled, eyes rimmed with exhaustion, but he smiled at both Emily and Molly, proud of what they had survived together. As he wished them well and headed for the door, he carried with him a quiet satisfaction. He knew this was a turning point. What happened that night in Chicago was not only about exposing darkness, but was also proof of how the right mix of courage and compassion from a few people could finally bring real hope and bring an end to a cycle that had gone on far too long.